Parenting is never easy. Parents from different generations will always debate on who had it easier and who had it harder. But being a parent during the 80s had its pros and cons, just like any other time period. If you've ever wondered what it was like to parent during the decade, then this video is for you. Are the kids getting on your nerves? That's an easy fix in the 80s. Just tell them to go outside and do something. Anything. If they were outside of the house, you didn't care. Back then, you didn't have to worry about confiscating tablets or iPhones. Everything would be just fine as long as they were home by the time the streetlights came on. Kids today can spend hours on the internet whenever they feel like they need an escape from reality. But in the 80s, that wasn't available. If you got your kid a bicycle in the 80s, then that was really all they needed to escape. Even if you got in a little tiff with them, you knew they would be just fine after a few hours on their BMX bike. 80s parents didn't worry anywhere near as much as what they do today. They could go an entire afternoon and sometimes an entire day without knowing the exact location of their kids. Were they at their friend's house or were they at the mall? It really didn't matter. Whatever they were up to was probably going to be just fine. As an 80s parent, it was easy to know everything that your kid was reading or listening to. They didn't have to search through anybody's browsing history. If you wanted to know what they were reading, then all you had to do was check out their bookshelf or look under their mattress. Their music was on cassette tapes and you could easily skim the titles for anything that seemed inappropriate. Glancing through their magazines would give you a great idea on how pop culture was shaping up. It may seem silly now, but parents in the 80s were genuinely concerned when their daughter dressed like Madonna from MTV. The video borderline could make her look like she was destined to have a future of truancy and ill repute. If 80s parents thought that was bad, then I'm sure they got really happy when they saw what their grandkids and great-grandkids were wearing in the future. During the 80s, it was impossible for a kid to be on the phone all day. And if they were, then it would tie up the family phone line, which meant that nobody else would be able to use it. That was something that 80s parents weren't going to allow. But if you did have kids on the phone, then you probably knew what was being said. Very few kids had phones of their own in their own rooms. Most telephones were in common areas such as living rooms or kitchens. As an 80s parent, be prepared to purchase a lot of hairspray, and especially so if you have a girl. What parent could forget the unmistakable odor of hairspray filling the halls of the house on a typical morning? Girls could spend hours in the bathroom making sure that their hair had the right poof in the right spot. Long after they left for school, thick clouds of Aquanet could still be lingering in the house. Car safety was something that many parents did not spend a lot of time on. Mandatory seatbelt wearing laws didn't make an appearance until 1984, and even then it wasn't everywhere. Booster seats for kids in the 80s seemed like an unnecessary luxury. If you wanted your kids to be safe, then just put them in the way back part of the station wagon. They would be perfectly fine rolling around with the groceries and clinging to the back seat or each other during sharp turns. An 80s parent wasn't living with the anxiety of sudden infant death syndrome. Back then, it didn't matter whether your baby wanted to sleep on their stomach, side, or back as long as they stayed in their crib. In fact, many mothers thought that sleeping on the back too much would make the back of the head look funny. One of the greatest family fun activities that you could do was head to the mall for some shopping, food, and of course fun. The whole family would climb into the car, and once they were at the mall, everyone would go their separate ways. Dad would go to Kenny's Shoes or check out the latest electronics at Montgomery Ward's. Mom would go and touch every single piece of clothing in every single store. Kids would go to the music store, then Spencer's, and most of their time was spent dropping quarters in arcade games. Later on, everyone would meet up in the food court for a hot dog on a stick and Orange Julius. As an 80s parent, you might have been older and wiser than your kids, but that didn't mean that you didn't worry about them. Sometimes you could be just as susceptible as they were to urban legends. For instance, the one about Mikey, the life serial kid who supposedly consumed a deadly combo of Pop Rocks and Coca-Cola and then his stomach exploded. You knew this couldn't be true, but you sure didn't want your kids to try it and see if it was. If you want to be a parent in the 80s, then you're going to need a sort of hands-off approach. Notice how Johnny is trying to lift the 19-inch television off of the shelf at age 5? When it falls on him, he'll only do it once. It's going to hurt him, but he will learn his lesson not to do that. And don't worry about that television, it had already fallen off the moving truck and it still works just fine. Televisions in those days would outlive your kids' childhood. You're also going to need to buy things for them so they can learn to be tougher, such as a slip and slide, trampoline with no sides, and yes, even shrinky dinks, which could burn them. 80s birthday parties were fun and they were mostly done at home. They never broke the bank and rarely involved any more effort than just baking a cake and remembering to pick up the candles. Your kids simply invited a small group of friends over, sang happy birthday, ate some cake, and then opened some gifts. Oh yeah, you were also going to let them play pin the tail on the donkey with a sharp tack after being spun in a circle and were completely dizzy. You know, 'cause danger was just needed. The whole thing took about 2 hours max and never cost you more than $50. Most parents in the 80s worked, so home-cooked breakfasts just weren't a thing. If your kids ate breakfast at all, then you felt like the parent of the year. Just buy them their favorite sugary cereal or Pop-Tarts and everything would be just fine. In fact, they'll probably love you for it. Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign was everywhere in the 80s. Most people knew very little about the crippling hold of addiction, so this campaign helped parents sleep a little more soundly at night. If your kids knew how to say no to drugs, then everything would be just fine, or at least that's what you tried to convince yourself of. If your kid was little in the 80s and you needed to get something done, then it was always a perfect opportunity to do so during Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. There's nothing wrong with leaving your child in front of a television screen while you scramble for your free time. That may not have been the best thing to do, but we all trusted Mr. Rogers. Besides, he taught them good life lessons, and what was better than that? Kids today rarely even watch television. Most of what they like is on their phone with Netflix or social media. Very rarely do they ever watch the same shows as their parents watch. But in the 1980s, every television could be shared with the whole family. Cheers, MASH, Family Ties, and ALF were all shows that the whole family could watch together. When your kids were watching something on their own, you pretty well knew what it was. Cartoons weren't available all the time. They were on before and after school and of course on Saturday mornings. On the average weekday, an 80s parent never had to wonder, are they up there in the room watching something terrible because there were no streaming services? MTV seemed about the worst thing that your kids could watch. Many parents in the 80s were convinced that a channel featuring 24 hours of music videos and singers in tight pants with big hair was going to rot their kids' minds. In retrospect, those videos weren't all that bad. Even the worst ones pale in comparison to what many kids see on their phones today. In the 80s, many parents were concerned about their kids spending too much time playing video games. Today, it is still a controversial topic, especially when it concerns video games and violence. But now 80s parents can rest easy knowing that about the worst that their kids ever played involved eating ghosts or helping a frog cross a busy road. Donkey Kong sure never inspired kids to throw barrels at Italian men. 80s parents were never competing with each other. Social media wasn't around, so they weren't trying to up another family's vacation or photos. They didn't compare notes about children reaching certain milestones or performance levels. All parents really cared about was whether their own child was doing their very best. Dinner time in the 80s was a very special time when everyone gathered around the table and spoke to each other. It wasn't just something that we saw on television. Kids weren't on their phones or listening to music. To parents today, this may seem like a fantasy, but it did really happen. Even the worst dinner conversations are something that we will never forget. In the 80s, particularly in the earlier part, smoking pretty well happened anywhere. Sure, cigarette packages had warnings from the Surgeon General, but that didn't stop anyone. There were ashtrays in the car, planes, buses, and so much more. Parents even bought their kids candy cigarettes. Secondhand smoke was just something that everyone had to live with, even if you weren't a smoker. A sunburn in the 80s meant that you were just outside doing something fun. No one wanted to be pale, and sunblock wasn't really something that people wanted. SPF levels were low, and many people used oils to increase their sun exposure. No one considered getting skin cancer from not wearing sunblock. So when we saw someone outside in the sun, it wasn't even a topic of conversation. It may seem crazy now, but during the 80s it was really possible to be unreachable. We didn't carry around cell phones, and during the earlier part of the decade, most people didn't even have answering machines. If you wanted a little privacy, then all you had to do was take the phone off the hook. Nobody ever asked, "Did you not get my texts, voicemails, or Facebook messages?" That ability to go off the hook was just that, the freedom to swim around and relax as you want. Parenting styles may have changed, but there's no denying that this 80s style of parenting worked for its time. Could it be done today? Sure, but it would be a lot more challenging. Were you a parent of the 80s? Or maybe you would just like to share how your parents were during that decade. I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. As always, thank you so much for watching.